Okay, tonight's lecture is going to focus on biological beginnings, and we're going to open up with a statement made by a zoologist by the name of Desmond Morris, and he goes on to say that there is 193 species of primates, and 192 of them are covered with hair, and the one that is not covered with hair is self-named, and that is Homo sapien, you and I. And what's interesting about his expression as a zoologist is he recognized early on that we share genetic history with other primates, and science has recently confirmed that. So we share 99% of our DNA with a chimpanzee, and we share 98% of our DNA with a gorilla. What's even more profound is that we share 50% of our DNA with plants, and we share 44% with that of a banana. So it seems to be a natural foundation of genetics that is the origin of many of us. And sometimes when they talk about the tree of life, they're talking about the tree in the sense that a tree has many branches that diverge from the main branch. And as a result of that, we are just one branch on another branch that has a common ancestry or even a common origin, as denoted by what Desmond Morris said and also what genetics now tells us about. Now, one of the things that I want to focus on initially is this chart right here. And we're not really sure why our species is much different than other primates. And of course, there's a lot of thought that has gone into this subject matter. And one thing is clear. They say that for some strange reasons, we ventured from the trees, we made our way to the ground, and then we started to venture onto the savannas, where we started to organize ourselves in small communities to live. And then from there, hunting-gathering societies started to emerge. And one of the key catalysts, they say, that could have potentially been the driving force behind our evolution, which means change, is fire. And fire allows us to cook meat and also have a diet that is more rich with protein, and that could have allowed our brain to develop differently than other primates, which could potentially explain why our species is much different than other neighboring species as well. And we're the only species on the planet that seems to be able to master our environment and set up learning communities like the one that you're in right now, so we can have discussions about said topics that are interesting for us and also interesting for the subject matter that we talk about. What's interesting about this chart, a human's brain will be approximately 1,300 milliliters by the time they are 14 years of age. Now, the human brain is that of an adult size by the time they're age 7. But one of the interesting things about age 14 is they are ready now to have children. In other words, they've already reached reproductive readiness, and they're now ready to pass their genes on to another progeny of species, or humans. And 1,300 milliliters basically means that the brain is approximately 2.86 pounds. Now, if we compare and contrast that with a gorilla, we recognize that a gorilla at age 7 approximately will have a brain size of 500 milliliters. Now, that's significant because that translates to 1.1 pounds. Now, think about that. They share 98% of their genetics with us, and yet their brain size is almost 2 pounds smaller. Significant. Then we look at 200 for the rhesus, or maybe even a gibbon monkey, which for the most part is ready to be reproductively mature at 6 or just after 6. And at 200 milliliters, that's basically a weight size of 0.44 for their brain, or let's just put it simple, less than a half a pound. And for some strange reason, our species stands out as a result of some of these differences that we're mentioning. And the book says that perhaps one of the reasons why it takes us much longer, 7 years in fact, to be reproductively mature compared to a gorilla and also a chimpanzee to basically pass our genes on to another generation, is because our society or our culture is much different than chimp or even gorilla culture. And it's more sophisticated because of language and so forth, and the way we have to understand and understand the complexity of our societies. Whatever the reasons are, evolutionary theory starts to become a talking point here. And one of the first things that I want to mention is when we think about evolution, which simply means change, we often think of Charles Darwin, rightfully so. But we need to actually just bring attention to another individual just for a moment by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And Lamarck published work on the theory of the transmutation of species, which discusses evolutionary process. And that paper actually influenced Charles Darwin. And then in 1859, Charles Darwin, after traveling through the Galapagos Islands, he wrote on the origin of species. And that was a very important book, great read, also a very dense book, but certainly well worth reading for the classics. He didn't create evolution, he just expounded on it. And one of the things that he gets credit for is simply that he explained the process that is associated with natural selection. And that's an important premise here. So with natural selection, he's not typically talking about psychological differences, but evolutionary psychology is clearly talking about various things like that. What he is talking about, Charles Darwin, that is he started to catalog the differences of particular species on one island and compare it and contrast them on another neighboring island not too far in the distance from the Galapagos where he was traveling. And he started to notice that they had physical adaptations. And these physical adaptations, he reasoned, were attributed to specific food sources, and it was a constant competition for these species to compete for food and also water and other resources. And also, let's not forget about sexual selection as well, and that certainly plays a part of it, and I'll demonstrate that in just a moment to understand the process of natural selection. But what we find here is that natural selection is also bringing in adaptation. He does talk about survival, and he says those that are able to adapt quick enough are those species that will be more fit. For Darwin, he's not saying that this species needs to be the strongest, like how many push-ups you can do. What he means by that is that it's tied to reproductive fitness. In other words, what Darwin is saying is that they only need to live long enough to become reproductively ready. And if they can live up to the time when they're reproductively ready to pass on their genes to another generation, it means that they've already made certain adaptations, and those adaptations become noticeable to others, and you're more likely to mate as a result of that. And they tend to be more likely to survive that next generation. It wasn't until about a decade after the publication on the origin of species when you have Herbert Spencer, who was influenced by Darwin, write the principles of biology. And he actually uses and coins the term survival of the fittest. So Darwin did not actually coin that, although he talked extensively about survival of one species as opposed to another, and he started to make connections with one's environment. So the survival of the fittest will be credited to Herbert Spencer. Now, an example to demonstrate why he's recognized, Darwin that is, that he has explained the process of natural selection. I'll give you an example that may or may not have happened, but it's something I would like you guys to remember. If you have red-feathered and also blue-feathered birds on a particular island, and a predator on that island likes to feed on these birds, but the predator is unable to see the red-feathered birds, it means that the red-feathered birds would be more likely to be in abundance and their population would increase accordingly. The blue-feathered birds would be detected by this predator, and as a result, they would be more likely to be eaten. As a result of that, you've got also mate selection involved in this process where they would realize that this predator does not actually go after the red-feathered birds. As a result, they would actually start to populate and procreate more in that particular setting. So that's a good example of what he meant by the process of natural selection. And of course, the adaptive nature of this component of natural selection basically means that you can have a tribe of baboons, for example, and as they're venturing away from their immediate tribe and moving towards the boundary of their community, they stumble haphazardly, of course, on a fruit tree. And they discover different berries and different fruits. And because when they eat it, they naturally start to feel better, and they realize it's providing them with some type of nourishment. And of course, we understand that they're not going to be able to explain that, but they certainly feel that they're experiencing something that makes their body feel good, just like when we eat an apple or maybe something like that. We may not like to eat apples all the time, but we recognize it's healthy for us, and we feel good sometimes when we do eat it. And the same thing with baboons. So they quickly start to adjust their diet, and they start to incorporate these different fruits and berries into their diet because they recognize they feel differently as a consequence of that. And that is certainly part of natural selection and adaptive behavior. And of course, there's also another example, and that is of an eagle. Now, if you think about the nature of an eagle, people, an eagle is a solitary creature. They hunt by themselves. They fly in the sky, and they have great focus when it comes to vision. And they get a bird's eye view from the sky looking down at the ground. And let's just say, for example, that they see a rodent, or let's just say a rabbit that is just scurrying across the plains of the Serengeti Plains or something of that nature. They focus on them, and then when they swoop down, they're able to latch onto them with their talons, and we realize that this is another example of adaptive behavior. In this sense, it's literally physical, and as such, eagles have adapted their physical claws to be fierce hunting tools, so they can actually prey individually in solitary environments and survive. That would be a good example right there. But then we take it a step further, and we say to ourselves, well, what about women when it comes to childbearing? And one of the things that I want to mention is Pitocin, because we recognize that when a mother gives birth, she gives birth prematurely to a neonate or an infant. And what I mean by that, if you think about the size of us and compare it to other mammals, we should really have a gestation period from beginning to end of 2 years, or 24 months. Yet when we go through prenatal development and when we go through gestation, we're basically expecting 9 months, or 266 days, or 280 days, which translates in weeks to 38 to 40 weeks. And that's significant, because then you say to yourself, what keeps this mother attached emotionally and physically to her offspring? The answer is complicated, but one of the reasons is oxytocin. And oxytocin is kind of like the love hormone. And as such, it's helpful for a woman for several things. While she's giving birth, for example, it helps with the uterine contractions. It also helps regulate the bleeding in the afterbirth. It also helps the mammary gland to start to get ready to produce milk for feeding and breastfeeding. But it also keeps her emotionally attached to the neonate and the infant for long periods of time. So we realize that they have more compassion, which is basically saying that they feel pity and they feel obligated to help this defenseless creature while they are actually becoming stronger, because they can't defend themselves. If you think about compassion long after prenatal, and where your compassion starts and ends with most adult relationships, you realize it has a limitation, don't you? But that limitation is pushed well beyond those boundaries when you're defenseless and you're in infancy and certainly early childhood and so forth, until you can actually take care of yourself. And then think about this, as I made the comment that prenatally we should be in gestation for up to 24 months. If we just think about the way women are made physically, just let's bring attention to their hips. Their hips have a hole in it, and that's where the birth canal is. And as they are giving birth, we realize that the size of the hips can determine whether or not they will successfully give birth or unsuccessfully. And what that simply means is that the hips can't be too wide, because if they're too wide, they're not able to run away from predators. If they're too narrow, they're more likely not to give birth successfully, and many babies, as a result of that, usually die at birth or shortly afterwards. And because the hole associated with the pelvis is actually so small, you'll notice, and this is basically foreshadowing for chapter 3, you'll notice that the head is deeply compressed at birth, and it appears as a cone shape. And as such, it takes several days before the head of the new baby or neonate returns back to its normal size of a spear. It's quite interesting. So we realized that for child rearing and for emotional and physical attachment, that's necessary. And of course, you might be thinking, do guys secrete oxytocin? And the answer is yes. And they secrete it at different levels, and that's because they also have testosterone that is secreted in larger degrees, and that partially explains from the research why guys don't like to cuddle in the same fashion as girls. And you can attribute that to oxytocin, testosterone, and the combination and degrees in which we experience it. As such, when we talk about evolutionary theory, we see that an evolutionary psychology is now starting to develop at this point. And evolutionary psychology is basically saying that it's focused on adaptation, reproduction, and survival. Now, part of what they talk about when it comes to human development, they talk about how we develop and our psychological mechanisms start to develop over a period of time. And one of the things that they talk about is domain-specific and also the brain being equivalent to a general-purpose device. In fact, it's not a general-purpose device, and the reason for that, to give you a modern example that I think we can all appreciate and also understand. If we don't know the answer to something, we're very quick to pick up our mobile devices and do a quick Google search. Give me a clap if you find yourself doing that. That's important to understand, because if we didn't need to actually search for an answer to a problem, we would not need to use Google to get the answer, because our brain would be able to figure it out very quickly, but it doesn't. So the brain is basically domain specific, and what that basically means is that the brain develops a series of modalities, and as such, we develop a modality perhaps for navigation, for mathematics, for trading, and anything else that you could possibly think of, maybe even proper way of hunting, for example, as hunting-gathering societies were taking off. And as such, they talk about the brain being domain-specific, and what that's meant to explain in the context of what I'm trying to communicate with a person's psychological makeup is that as we are in the field, as we are living our lives, we come across natural issues and problems. And these issues and problems need very specific solutions, and we can't think of these solutions fast enough. As such, we need time to think about it. And as we think and we reflect and we experience what's in our culture or in our environment, over time we start to develop an understanding of what we need to do. Maybe a good example is sometimes I think about how does the arms race with regard to weapons begins, and maybe a simple answer there is imagine people that have a reoccurring problem 2,000, 3,000, maybe 10,000, 20,000 years ago, and they're trying to figure out how to capture a bear which has a lot of meat on its bone for protein and calorie, so they can bring it back to their community and they would have food not only for the moment, but also maybe for a week or so if they learn how to actually preserve the meat with salt and stuff like that. The example here basically is how do you capture a bear without actually injuring or killing yourself? And as such, maybe somebody's walking around a campfire, and as they're walking around the campfire, they naturally step on a stone, and the stone is an arrowhead. And we know, geologically speaking, that arrowheads are made naturally. In this case, it wasn't shaped, it was just there. Not in perfect size, but nevertheless, it looks like an arrowhead. It cuts the bottom of the guy's foot. He then realizes he's bleeding. But as he's bleeding, he pays more attention to the stone than he does his own wound, because right there, he's got that one thought. That's my solution to the problem I have. And he takes the poker for the fire, he grabs it, He attaches the rock, which is shaped like an arrowhead, onto the tip of it. He then takes animal ligaments and attaches it that way, and now he has a spear and potentially the beginning of an arms race. And now you start to see the development of weapons and rudimentary tools. And since that time period, our weaponry and our tools have become quite sophisticated. And it all had an origin or a time in which it started. So for that reason, you realize that it's domain specific, and we're looking for physical traits and also psychological makeup that can actually help us understand that process. They often compare it to a Swiss Army knife. And the reason that they compare it to a Swiss Army knife, if any of you have ever seen one, it usually has multiple modules built into it, or multiple functions. You can use it as a saw, a screwdriver, a knife, even a file. So it's multifaceted. It's great if you're going to go into the woods and you need it for one thing or if not another. And they say the brain is much like that as well. And the brain has different modules that we often have to rely on. And then there's some criticism with that theory too, saying that, you know, the brain really isn't organized like that or compartmentalized into very specific parts for that. But nevertheless, I'm always reminded that the primary visual cortex is in the posterior part of the brain for vision. And then spatial reasoning is typically associated with the parietal lobe. So when we think about how there are some primary functions of certain brain areas, we realize that maybe the Swiss Army knife is a good analogy here. Now let's just mention food scarce environments, because they're not really adaptive for contemporary society. And what that simply means in the book is that if you think about 5, 10, 20,000 years ago, or let's just say during the Stone Age, when food was scarce because, one, they didn't have a way of basically getting food consistently, they didn't have a way to prepare it consistently, they didn't have refrigerators the way we do, they certainly didn't have a stove. You know, it was literally a scratch kitchen for the most part every single day. As a result of that, their hunters that go into the wilderness don't always come back with the right amount of food for the rest of the people. And sometimes they come back with nothing at all. So you could imagine in environments like that you have to rely on an exotic salad that you can basically put together from a tree or maybe a berry tree or something like that. And because food is so scarce at this point, and sometimes when it is available in abundance, there's that natural tendency to want to overeat. And when they overeat, it's mainly because they've evolved that mechanism, because they also recognize that food might not be available the way it is right now for the next week, 2 weeks, and so forth. And they might have to change their diet more to that version of a salad in that environment. Now, the reason it's not adaptive for contemporary society is very simple. When we go home tonight, give me a clap if you plan to go into the refrigerator at about 9 o'clock to get something to eat based on the way you understand yourself. Fair assumption, most people do. And because of that, we basically are doing the same thing that our ancestors did. The only thing is we don't have a shortage of food. And as a result of that, we have higher obesity, we have higher rates of cardiovascular disease and heart disease. We also have problems with type 2 diabetes, and even in early adolescence now, we see kids not only being more obese at this point, but they're also experiencing higher incident rates of type 2 diabetes, which you'll learn in an upcoming chapter, something that was not dominant 1 to 2 generations ago. So we recognize that we're still doing the same things that our ancestors did. And then we have the relationship between some comfort foods rich in carbohydrates and specific neurotransmitters. And let's just be direct and honest here in order for this to work the way I'm hoping it works. How many of you in here find yourself sometimes really sad or even depressed? Give me a clap. And how many of you recognize you have very specific foods that you eat that usually are not very healthy when you're feeling that way? Give me a clap. And how many of you recognize that the foods you eat are high in fat and also high in carbohydrate and not necessarily rich in protein? Give me a clap. The reason that actually happens is because we naturally default to that And there's a good explanation on a neurological reason. And the reason is because when we eat foods that are rich in carbohydrates and fats, and we don't eat enough protein, we eat more than we should, that's one thing. And then secondly, we find that serotonin and dopamine levels actually start to increase. And serotonin makes you feel more contentment and happiness, and the dopamine spike allows you to feel more pleasure associated with it. How many of you have recognized that when you are feeling sad or depressed and you eat foods like that, rather quickly you feel a little bit better? Give me a clap if you recognize that. And that's a natural thing. So we tend to do stuff like that constantly. And the reason I'm bringing this up is the next time you experience that, I want you to be cognitively alert of why you might be doing that. Because if you're aware of it, then you might actually be in a position to start making changes. Maybe go for a walk or even a jog because you can get an endorphin release, and that would probably be a little bit healthier. And then it brings us to Paul Botts, and he's one of the architects for lifespan theory. And what Paul is saying is that the benefits conferred or granted on us early in life, and in the morning of our lives, which is relatively early, let's just say in the first 25 years, we recognize, according to what he's saying, that we are more likely to be reproductively ready and pass our genes on to another generation. And as we actually get older, that actually decreases. And when it decreases, he said there's more of a tendency, as seen in this one area where the y-axis is for culture and then the lifespan is on the x-axis. What he's talking about right here is in the first part of our life, the younger you are, the less likely it is that you're interested in culture. And culture could be a variety of different things for people. But as we get older, we realize that we start to reach the afternoon of our life, which is roughly at about 40 to 50. And at that point, the need for an interest in developing and understanding culture becomes the forefront of our interest. And he says with older people, for example, they switch to a culture-based resources which is focused on cognitive skills, literacy, medical technology, and social support. I'm always reminded that when I went to a Thanksgiving dinner recently this past year, the adults at the table were talking about, much older than me, they were talking about what doctors they went to, what new prescription they got, what's going on with their physiology and biology and so forth, and then comparing and contrasting against other people that they know. And I thought to myself, wow, this is interesting. You know, I thought about what Paul was saying here in the context of what I was experiencing during dinner, and I said, is that what I have to look forward to? But the point here is when we look at this graph on the left side and we look at the evolutionary selection benefits, we realize that in the first part of our life, usually you tend to be more physically active. You don't really have much of an interest in culture. It doesn't mean culture is absent from your life, of course, but it means that from Paul's perspective, it's just not dominant. And as you get older, that interest of selection benefits starts to decline as you get older. Now, the reason that this is important to understand is what he's saying here is that natural selection operates primarily on the characteristics that are tied to reproductive fitness. So let's just look at Alzheimer's disease, for example. Alzheimer's disease typically starts to inflict an older generation, typically at about 65 years of age. And we do know and we do recognize that there are warning signs that they might be experiencing it a little bit earlier than previously thought. And that's clear. But it becomes really noticeable and detectable when they're about 65 years of age, for the most part, is what the book says. Now, if it takes 65 years for us to recognize that they might have dementia or even Alzheimer's, let's just think about average life expectancy. Prehistoric times, 18. Ancient Greek society, age 20. Were people having Alzheimer's at this point? Probably not. And of course, there are people that might have been experiencing dementia and Alzheimer's as the natural age started to increase to 41, for example, because that means there's people living over that and people living slightly below that, but not in large numbers. So is it really a concern? The answer is no. Now in the year 1900, we're living until age 47. Is Alzheimer's a concern at this point? No. Does it mean that nobody experienced it? Not necessarily, because people were living until 60, 65, but they were very small in number. And there could have been warning signs that they were experiencing it. For the most part, we didn't pay too much attention. Now that people are living to average of 79 years of age, is it a problem? It is a problem, isn't it? And then you start to wonder, what could be some of the reasons for it? Is it genetic based? Is it something in the environment? Are there any industrial exposures that these people are being exposed to, like chemicals? Maybe they're working on a farm. Maybe they have early head injuries or several concussions. That could be a contributing factor as well. Is there higher levels of mercury in their diet? Is there higher levels of aluminum that can be traced to that? You know, are there amyloids that are in the brain? Is there too much protein in the brain that can also be contributing to what's referred to as Lewy body dementia? These are all questions that you start to ask, because now we realize that right now we could be living to 79 or maybe even older. And as we start pushing those upper boundaries of our own existence, we realize that some illnesses that we are fearful of, I know I certainly am, we might be exposed to at a certain season in our lives. And what Paul is saying here is that if people were aware, if Alzheimer's was inflicting a population, let's just say at age 15, 16, would people avoid, or would people still mate with those individuals and pass their genes on to another generation? What do you guys think? Any thoughts? Do you think people would be willing to mate with people, as far as sexual selection is concerned, with individuals that have Alzheimer's at age 15 or 18? Do you think that they would be all right, I see you shaking your head no, and I would agree. And why do you say that?
They wouldn't be as physically fit.
Correct. Now, because it doesn't typically inflict them until age 65, we know that we don't know if it's going to be in our genetic history unless we get specific genetic testing done now. But that's the point. If people were aware of it early on, they would have been able to manage it out of their gene pool. But they weren't able to, because life expectancy, the way we understand it, is really a phenomenon that we're enjoying in the last 122 years. And when you think about the existence of humankind, we realize it extends into the Stone Age and perhaps even much deeper than that. So these are things or challenges that we have to face now and try to come up with some type of cure or some type of way where we can manage it in a way that prevents us from experiencing it, you know, the worst side of dementia or even Alzheimer's. And then we have Albert Bandura. And Albert Bandura, you know, reflects on evolutionary theory. And he says that evolutionary theory is too one-sided. And evolution, as I mentioned before, means change. And a species just doesn't come into existence and becomes what they are meant to be. There's other forces here that he recognizes. And he's also saying here, Bandura, that there are evolutionary pressures that are created which accounts for changes in our biological structures. And this is an important premise because according to Bandura, if he's right, he's saying it led to higher degrees of consciousness, thought, and even the propensity and capacity for us to acquire and also master language. And this is important too because he's saying that evolutionary theory is one-sided. It should be more bidirectional, meaning that it should be going in multiple directions for various reasons. If we just bring attention right here to this triangle is basically the triadic reciprocal determinism, and it's also coming out of what he referred to as the social cognitive theory. And if we look at each point here, it has an arrow on both sides. That's meant to say that each of these dimensions go in both directions, not one. So cognitive ability with a person can influence behavior, and it can also influence environment. And I think we recognize that at this point, and that's what Bandura was actually saying. And we also now recognize that our environments can change people's behavior, and environments can also change the way people think, just like behavior can change both the way people think and also their environment. It goes in multiple directions and is not a path that is direct from A to B, but it's rather complex. And it's interesting too, because in another part of the book you'll learn about Noam Chomsky, and he talks about the language acquisition device. And what he's saying here is that regardless of where you live in the world, there is an innate ability to understand language. He's saying it's universal. And the basic rules for grammar and syntax are straight across the board, regardless of where you live. And there's also a sensitive period. And we know from other types of studies that if you deny people sensory experiences related to reading and writing and also listening, for example, certain parts specifically do not mature. And as a result of it going outside that sensitive period, they may never be able to use language the way we can. And I think to some degree we take that for granted. We'll talk more about that at a later date. Now, to mention an interesting thought about the criticism regarding evolutionary psychology, it says that it doesn't adequately value social environmental factors, and that's the point that Bandura is saying. It's more complex than just saying there's changes. And it also relies on after-the-fact explanations, and you can't test it scientifically. Well, here's the interesting thing. One of the biggest criticisms is that we can't test evolution scientifically because it needs to be observable and measurable, and it takes generation after generation after generation for that to happen. Recently, in 2019, we have identical twins. And identical twins, they come from one egg, one sperm. The egg fertilizes. It splits into two genetically identical people. And in this case, their name is Scott and Mark Kelly. They're both astronauts for NASA. And in 2019, Scott went into space, and his brother Mark stayed down here before he went. They measured and they examined their DNA before he went into space for 1 year. When Scott was in space, his DNA changed. Well, I shouldn't say that. The sequence of his DNA remained unchanged. What did change was genetic expression of genes. And when he returned back to Earth, they examined their genetics again, and that's how they were able to observe it. So although you cannot actually test evolution over a period of time because it's outside the scope of observation and measurement, changing an environment from Earth to space provides the very conditions that are so hostile to human existence that we now have observed in less than a year from when they measured it, that changes in genes were actually starting to change as a result of it. So certain genes were being expressed. Now that's important because I think that study also showed that approximately 6 months later, Scott's genes that were turned on because of being in space actually reverted back to the way it was prior to the space exploration trip. Fascinating, isn't it? So I think if there's more stability in one's environment, you're not going to really be able to observe the effects of evolution as quickly.